Ladies, gentlemen, and barbarians of all ages, welcome one and all to the proper final progression of the Dust Devil build in Season 4 that we've been going over basically since the PTR, honestly. And while I know I'm not the first person to talk about it, it is a popular build right now, sure. I'm going to give you the most defensive version that you will ever find, because the truth is the vast majority of your offense is sorted in this build nearly fully through just a handful of synergies, and a lot of people just sort of then push damage further than it needs to by any means, because to put it simply, when it comes to speed clearing, once you one-shot enemies, more damage is pointless. And once you get to the really hard stuff like higher tier pit runs or tormented level 200 bosses, your damage matters far less than your defense does, at least up to a point, sure. Which is why this is what I believe to be the sort of best of both worlds here. The perfect mixture of high offense and defense to both allow pushing harder content and to scale equally well as you get further into the endgame and upgrade your gear more and more, with basically the only thing that is able to kill me at this point being if I get too many stacks in a torment boss or if I stand in the ghost boss attacks in high tier pits, but both of those are very easily summed up as being skill issues, plain and simple. And the fact is, even those can't one-shot you easily if you're paying attention, only if you also mess up your cooldown. So with all that said, let's dive into a build that I like to call the Tasmanian Devil Barbarian, starting with the skill points and where to put them, the technique slot of choice, the legendaries and uniques that enable the build, and especially how to really perfect it, as well as the gear and affixes that you want to aim for in general, including the various stages and swaps you'll make along the way through various stat breakpoints, and then we'll talk about tempering affixes, and of course then dive into the full Paragon board setup to make it all happen. Without further ado then, your basic skill does not matter at all, so just stick 2 points in here to let us move to the next cluster. Then we are grabbing Whirlwind, as well as its enhancement that makes us generate Fury by hitting enemies with Whirlwind 2, and then Furious Whirlwind as well, which makes the skill apply bleeding on hit, as well to just activate some of our bleed reliant affixes and effects too. We also then take 1 rank in Expose Vulnerability here for a lucky hit chance to apply vulnerable with core skills, which is nice, but mostly just to let us reach the next cluster, as we need to spend the point here, and further points of Whirlwind itself are actually not really that useful, as our main damage is the Dust Devils, not the Whirlwind, so the extra effect is actually much better to have for when it does help us. Then in the defensive cluster, we're going to pick up a bunch of stuff, honestly. Rallying Cry, its enhancement, as well as Tactical Rallying Cry up here for a burst of resource, as well as a resource generation increase and movement speed increase as well, while the shout itself is active. Then we'll also be grabbing Iron Skin, as well as Enhanced Iron Skin and Tactical Iron Skin. This gives us a barrier for a large portion of our missing health when it's triggered, as well as healing us while active with the upgrade that we've taken. Then we also take Challenging Shout over here, as well as its enhancement, and also Tactical Challenging Shout for a defensive shout that increases your health, as well as giving you some damage reduction, while also giving you Fury each time you are hit while it's active. Then we take a bunch of passives in this cluster as well, 3 ranks of Imposing Presence for a big whack of bonus maximum life, honestly, 3 ranks of Martial Figure for bonus damage reduction against elites, 1 rank of Outburst, mostly just as a gateway to let us take 1 rank of Tough as Nails, which makes Thorns also apply bleed damage, thus making every enemy in combat with us to sort of essentially activate our bleed effects pretty automatically and passively. Then we move on to the Brawling cluster over here, and we're going to be starting with Warcry, as well as its enhancement, and also Power Warcry. Altogether, this gives you a shout that raises your damage done while active, even more so with enough enemies around you when you activate it. This also grants you Berserking when you activate it, which helps us chain the effect too in the gaps that we struggle with Lucky Hit. We also then take 3 ranks of the passive Booming Voice for longer duration on all 3 of our shouts, 3 ranks of Guttural Yell for a reduction of the damage done by any enemy that is within range of your shouts too. Then also 3 ranks of Aggressive Resistance for damage reduction while berserking, and then 3 ranks of Prolific Fury over here for bonus Fury generation while you're berserking as well. Then we move on to the Weapon Master cluster for just a few passives, 3 ranks of Pit Fighter over here for bonus damage to close enemies and damage reduction from distant enemies, 1 rank of Thick Skin for a little bit of fortified generation, but mostly just as a gateway for 3 ranks of Counter Offensive for bonus damage while fortified for at least 50% of your maximum life, and also 3 ranks of Defensive Stance for an increase to our damage reduction while fortified. Then we move to the Ultimate cluster, and here we're going to be taking Wrath of the Berserker as well as its enhancements, giving us an increased damage berserk state buff that we can cycle and keep active near permanently through our other effects, as well as granting unstoppable and resource generation while active too. For passives, we're going to be taking 3 ranks of Wallop over here for bonus damage with bludgeoning weapons to stunned or vulnerable enemies, and then 3 ranks of concussion as well, mostly just for the fact that it gives us lucky hit chance to stun enemies, and we also have extra ranks on this from the utility temper slots on gear too. Then finally for the key passive, we have Unconstrained over here, which simply boosts the damage bonus provided by berserking by a large amount, and so the outline of the build sort of is clear from this. As much tankiness as possible while staying in berserk state as often as possible, and firing out the maximum number of Dust Devils allowed that we can. With that in mind, let's talk about your technique slot, and this is honestly pretty standard for most any Barb build that you'll play, at least the high-end ones, which is the two-handed axe technique for bonus vulnerable damage. There are some builds in which you can justify using the two-handed sword expertise instead for the bleed damage application that it has, but this doesn't actually interact at all with Dust Devils, only applying bleed in relation to the base whirlwind damage, not any Dust Devils at all, so it's very cleanly not that, and instead more important to take axe technique for this type of build right here. That said, let's move on to our legendaries and uniques to make this all come together. As is becoming more common, there are actually no uniques that are required to have this function in the first place. However, I would recommend getting Rage of Herogath, mainly honestly for the defense that it has from the affixes on the chest that don't naturally appear on gear anymore otherwise, combined with a cooldown reduction effect as well, and some bonus crit chance on the chest too is quite lovely. That said, here's worth mentioning if you had one uber unique, and if you could choose any given one, which honestly you can this season provided you collect each of the guaranteed sparks, the ideal chest slot item is Tyrael's Might by a massive amount. The Holy Bolts are lovely sort of bonus damage from chest slot, but when you ignore that, the rest of the item is just defensively incredibly powerful too. An 8 damage reduction, all stats increase is lovely, especially as this doesn't appear on non-uniques anymore, but most importantly is the maximum resistance increase. Going from taking 75% reduced elemental damage to 80% reduced elemental damage is the equivalent of just taking 20% reduced elemental damage. So that's how you should read max resistance changes. This is a massive reduction to honestly the most worrying damage types in the game. I am never scared of physical hits really, so it's just a fantastic piece of gear for pushing the harder content that exists. If your concern is less survival and more just increasing your speed farm potential, then you would instead want the Ring of Starless Skies, which for this build might as well just read as 40% increased damage and 40% resource cost reduction, because why not? Unlike some Barb builds, we don't rely on Fury spent, so the reduction is actually still a good thing, and the damage increase is a multiplier, which obviously is quite strong. In an ideal world, you would have both of these uber uniques at the same time, but those are why you would prioritize each one if you could only have one. Aside of that, there are actually no uniques that are better to use than legendaries for this build. You can obviously make exceptions to that rule based on greater affix drops. Honestly, it's hard to provide hard rules these days, more so than just guidelines, because the RNG potential of gear can make normally bad things outshine the normally better ones. That said, let's talk about the aspects that you want to have on your legendaries. Fierce Winds is your most important one, firing off Dust Devils when you shout and increasing the size of all Dust Devils as well, while also increasing their damage by a multiplier equal to their size increase. Importantly, this does not overstack with the weapon temper affix of Dust Devil size. They count separately, so you still want 100% in that stat even with the size bonus from this affix, and you should of course be on a two-handed weapon slot for this too to give it double potency. Your other two-handed weapon aspect should be the Devilish aspect, which generates the Dust Devils proportionately to Fury generation. This means the more that we generate Fury, the more damage that we deal through this setup, and this is part of why Whirlwind is the basis of this, as it can generate its own Dust Devils through another aspect, while also actually gaining Fury when you hit enemies to summon them through this one too. Then in your Amulet slot for 50% bonus effectiveness, I have the Iron Blood defensive aspect. This gives you damage reduction per nearby bleeding enemy. All enemies will be bleeding, so this is always in effect. If you want to drop some tankiness in favor of damage, you would instead put Edge Masters up here, which I actually have on my own gloves for bonus damage when at high resources. And we've also got the Dust Devil aspect for Dust Devils generated from Whirlwind as mentioned before, and then the aspect of Elements for bonus damage with certain damage types cycling through. 50% of the time, this will boost your physical damage, and you can specifically try to time your burst damage from shouts with the physical boost with this cycle to actually maximize this bonus too. At minimum, it's a 15% damage increase on average over time if you don't adjust your playstyle, but if you lean into it purposefully and pay attention to the cycles, you can actually make it much more impactful than that too. Then for our resource legendaries, we have the Bold Chieftain aspect for shout cooldown reduction reduction, of course, as our shouts are extremely important. And then your other ring here is the slot that you would replace with Scarlet Skies if you had it. Otherwise, I recommend the aspect of Vocalized Empowerment just for more fury generation during your shouts, and thus more Dust Devils as well. Then for your utility aspect, on the boots, you actually really need this one. This one's quite important to the build. It is Relentless Berserker. This actually gives you a lucky hit chance to extend berserking when you deal damage with core skills, increased when you do crits with them. We have a number of effects that synergize through crit, and so this is a focus that we have, and this is really quite good as a result. Then for your defensive, you want the aspect of Numbing Wrath. This helmet that it's on, I know, is trash, stop judging me. I've just gotten extremely bad luck when it comes to helmet drops, but this aspect is where you get the majority of your fortify generation in the build, which contributes heavily to your defense. Then your final aspect should be the Juggernauts aspect on your pants specifically, until you sort out a more specific piece of gear. Technically speaking, you can have the raw armor affix on other pieces of gear, other slots, but it is nice and clean to have it on your pants. Then you also want to roll the Tempering defensive affix for % armor increase in one of your defensive slots. With these two things combined with 925 item power gear in general, Barb will hit armor cap and beyond with room to spare, which frees up the aspect slot to actually just be changed to Iron Warrior, which is a large part of our defensive synergy here, giving us a good chunk of extra damage reduction while Iron Skin's barrier is active. With that done, let's talk about the equipment in a more general sense. For your two-handed slashing weapon, a sword is ideal for the innate critical strike damage bonus that it has, and ideally your weapons you want strength, critical strike damage, and maximum life bonuses as your stats as a whole. Though again, greater affixes can mess with the balance of that a little bit, so it's more of a guideline than a hard fast rule. For the gems in your weapons as well, you actually want to sort of mix it a little bit, especially when you don't yet have a full set of royal gems, as the highest tier gems are really strong now, but take quite a bit of resources to craft. New gems are simple though. Emeralds in weapons give crit damage, sapphires give vulnerable damage. Ideally, you want your crit and vulnerable damage numbers to be somewhat balanced. I have a lot of critical strike from my other places on this build, so I have more sapphires than emeralds in my weapons to boost the vulnerable damage up in comparison, because 20% more vulnerable damage is worth more than 25% more crit damage if your numbers before that are 100% bonus to vulnerable damage and 450% crit due to the way that additive damage works and diminishing returns. Past that, you want cooldown reduction as high as possible. In an ideal situation, even greater affixes and the focus of your masterwork major upgrades too for cooldown reduction on helmet and amulet is this just the greatest power scaler for the build really. The lower your cooldowns, the more damage you have, the more defense you have. On your rings you want crit chance, and on your rings or gloves you also want lucky hit chance to apply vulnerable. This plugs one of our greatest holes in the build quite quickly, so get maximum 2 of these affixes or just one greater one once you've upgraded with some masterworking, and you should be applying vulnerable extremely consistently in our setup, even outside of the exploit glyph, which we had to deal with in an earlier version of this build with a whole aspect slot dedicated to applying vulnerable. So if you can get this stat worked out, you don't have to do that, which frees you up for more damage. Outside of that, pure strength as a stat is pretty important and also available on most slots. It's very good for your damage as well. Maximum health increases, especially as Barbarian can scale maximum health more than most classes can as well, which really increases the value of it as a stat, especially with our amount of damage mitigation as well, which is why your main armor gem is going to be rubies outside of specific scenarios, such as the sapphire that I have in my helmet for 100 bonus willpower. With all stats being removed from most gear, this actually lets us hit a specific breakpoint on a couple of Paragon nodes, which increases damage reduction of the build by 9%, which may sound small, but you know, it's those small optimizations that can really affect the top end capability of a build. Moving on then to the tempering affixes specifically, think of your weapons as having 6 total weapon temper slots. The two-handed weapons count as 2 slots each because they are double potency, whereas each one-hander only counts as 1. Depending on your luck, your exact split of what will go where may be different than mine, because tempering is not an exact science. Early on, you want 3 of your slots dedicated to Dust Devil size. Specifically, you would do that with 1 of your two-handers and 1 of your one-handers. This will get you close to getting a 100% on that stat, which is the maximum that the stat has now. And as your gear gets upgraded, you can actually focus on getting a major upgrade from masterworking on Dust Devil size on the two-hander, and then you can just cut out the 3rd slot here. So my Dust Devil size is managed entirely between my one-handed weapons, which would reach 72% if they were perfect rolls, and as I masterwork them, they will reach 100% between the 2 of them. Then you just want your other slots split between the other affixes that are on the same tempering manual, honestly. High chance to fire bonus projectiles with Dust Devil is extremely good, but the maximum number of Dust Devils that you can have on screen at any time is capped at 15. So if you overshoot this one too hard, you will reach that cap and it will be useless. So you want to sort of limit yourself to one of these, which is perfect here on a two-hander. And instead in your other two-hander, we get Dust Devil damage to just increase the damage itself of each Dust Devil that we create. Then for your offense tempers, you want a ton of damage while berserking affixes, but damage while close is also good too, to diversify your damage a little bit into more different buckets instead of stacking the same stat over and over. Defensive temper should be one singular % armor increase, as we mentioned earlier, and the rest should be challenging shout, cooldown reduction, or resistances if you really need to. Utility should be either concussion ranks for bonus stun chance or stun duration when the stun actually hits. Mobility, you just want raw movement speed, really, honestly, more than anything else. Then for resources, you want Warcry cooldown reduction on your rings, and then one roll of resource generation with one-handed weapons on your amulet, which just pumps up our Dust Devil creation rate a fairly large amount. With that covered then, let's dive into the Paragon board setup for today, and first what you want to do is go to the starting board itself and head up the right side here through the damage rare node to the glyph socket. A little trick here then is early on in the end game, if you go up the left side early on, it will help you reach the armor cap if you aren't reaching it through other places then, and then you can switch it over once you hit the armor cap through other means. But then in the glyph socket here, we're going to be taking the exploit glyph and then filling dexterity around it to activate it for bonus damage to vulnerable enemies, as well as vulnerable application on first damage to each enemy that you fight. Then we head up the left side of the board and out of the top to attach on the Warbringer board, like so. Head up and left to grab some maximum fury and fury on kill, rare and magic nodes as well. Then you want to wrap back around to the right to the glyph socket here and stick in the Wrath glyph. This gives you bonus damage with critical strikes, of course, which is pretty important, but the additional bonus for this is actually fury generation when you get crits, which is extremely important to our fury generation in the build, which again translates directly, very directly to damage because we generate Dust Devils through fury generation. Then we take the rare and magic nodes out here before heading at the right side of the board and attaching on the Blood Rage board, which is extremely important for us. We head over to the right and then down and wrap around through the rare node to the legendary node itself over here, which gives you a chance when killing a bleeding enemy to gain berserking for 5 seconds. As well, it gives you an increase to your general damage, a proper multiplier on all damage that you do related to your damage while berserking stat, which we of course stack really hard because we focus on berserking, so we do reach the maximum of this quite easily, and you can quite early into endgame as well. Then you want to backtrack up to the glyph socket over here and stick in the martial glyph like I have here for a bonus to nearby magic nodes, as well as a cooldown reduction to non-shouts when you use your shout skills. And that's the heart of why we are so tanky, really. We stack a ton of cooldown reduction and use cooldown reduction on our shouts as well. When you hit Iron Skin, you become very tanky, so you should use that once you start to take damage. Then once that goes on cooldown, you can use your shouts to both do damage and make yourself tankier, while also reducing Iron Skin's cooldown in the meantime, so you can just press it again when you need to. And that's sort of the cycle of it all, really. Grab the strength and relevant rare nodes in the radius as well, keeping in mind that stat-based magic nodes are worth extra in here and help us reach different breakpoints later on as well. Then you want to head out the top side of the board and attach on the Carnage board like this, then head up and right to the glyph socket itself to stick in the Twister glyph here. This simply boosts Dust Devil damage straight up, as well as increasing the damage that you do in general after firing out a Dust Devil. The cluster in this radius has the most strength nodes of any board that Barb has access to, and so we quite simply grab the rare and magic nodes in the radius of note, then we just grab every single strength that is in that radius to boost the Dust Devil damage on that glyph as much as physically possible. Then we head out the left side through the damage while berserking rare and magic nodes here to get to the exit of the board, and here we're going to be sticking on the Flawless Technique board. Then you want to go left and up over to the glyph socket itself, inside of which we are putting the Ambidextrous glyph for another magic node increase and an increase to all damage done while wielding one-handed weapons, which we constantly are. We then grab the rare and magic nodes of relevance in the area too, again remembering that all of the magic nodes in this area are boosted, so the stat boost ones here are extra useful and therefore help with our different breakpoints on other nodes. Then we head out, down, and around through some rare nodes too, including this cold resistance node over here that I have. You might not need this depending on your gear, but it's 2 points for some maximum life and a bunch of cold resistance, so I took it. And you use that to wrap around to the legendary node itself, which gives you bonus critical hit chance when you damage enemies with one-handed weapons, which we do constantly, and the critical hit chance just helps fuel our berserk resets from our boots, as well as our fury generation from the Wrath glyph. It's all very good to have more crit chance and crit damage. It's sort of a main thing that we're building around. After that, we head back to the previous board, and we exit at the top side through the right side like this to get through another damage while berserking rare node. Then we go out and we attach the final board, the Decimator board. Here you want to go up and right specifically, just a little bit more willpower that we rip out of here by doing this, and trust me, that's just what gets us to our breakpoints. So we get to the glyph socket itself, and inside of this one we want to put the Ire glyph. This gives you bonus damage while berserking depending on the strength you purchase in the radius, and also the additional bonus is damage reduction from elites while berserking too, which is actually very nice. You want to grab the rare and magic nodes in the radius of note 2 as much as you can, and then use your remaining points finally off just to get the legendary node of the board, which gives you a 10% increase to your damage as a multiplier for 5 seconds after making any enemy vulnerable, which we do constantly through our setup now, and also overpowering a vulnerable enemy gives you an additional 10% damage multiplier for 5 seconds after that, but we don't really focus on overpower in any way. We don't have any guaranteed overpowers, so this is basically just the initial 10% damage multiplier, but that's still extremely good, honestly. And that just about does it as far as actually putting the build together, all the stuff that you need and how to do it. So let's just talk briefly about how to play it in general once you have it. For more speed farming level content, just go through whacking your shouts at things and spinning the whole way through, and everything will die. Nothing can stop you. For harder stuff, Wrath of the Berserker always at the start of combat, as you can elongate the damage bonus of this regardless and make it last as long as you stay berserking. Then you want to spin into enemies and press Iron Skin when you reach around half health, or if you know you're about to be one shot or something like that. At that point, you use Warcry to increase the damage that you do if you have built up Wrath of the Berserker properly, or you can use it to bridge the gap on berserking if you are getting unlucky with your lucky hit chance. Rallying Cry is great for unstoppable mostly, as well as resource generation, and essentially it's just our biggest damage burst nuke as a result due to our aspects and the way that the things work. And then Challenging Shout is basically your backup damage reduction skill for when Iron Skin is down, or even to use in combination if you think you're about to get thoroughly thwacked. That's pretty much it for today then, everyone. Just a quite deep, proper endgame guide on the final version of the Tasmanian Devil Barbarian build for Season 4. Just a real sort of coming together of a ton of different both offensive and defensive synergies to make something truly monstrous out of such a simple and silly concept, honestly, which is always what I love seeing at the end of the day. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.